Hello everyone, my name is Daniel Chun. I'm very happy to be here to share with you some of my industry insights regarding mobile computing. Uh, in the rest of the course, I would like to share with you some of the history about mobile computing, how people adopt mobile computing, and also in later on I would have other videos that share with you about the technology, mobile computing, the impact with the industry 4.0 and versus what people talk about now, smart cities and IoT and network security. So without further ado, let's begin. Yeah. So the people talk about mobile computing in different contexts, and what we think that drives a lot of these evolution, these changes, this game-changing technology. One of them is the need for digitization. And in the old days, telecom networks, when we just use a telephone, we actually basically it's a rotary dial analog telephone. A lot of the teenagers or the millennials that we talk about probably would have no recollection of what a rotary dial phone looks like. Over here I have some pictures to show you. That's how the evolutions of the basic communications, how people actually talk to each other, how machines able to communicate with each other, and then the people can perhaps conduct business activities or to communicate for various reasons, whether it's for air traffic control, or other business duties. So over the years, technology, engineering, communication engineering, data communications have evolved from very old stage era of people talk about 1010, but at the end of the day, you need a fairly good network infrastructure to be able to communicate these data in big volume. And as we progress to the society today, we talk about devices that are even more fancy. So there are a lot of requirements on the network itself, the infrastructure being provided by, we assume that someone will provide it, but actually in the old days, it's what we call the telecom or utility company that builds those infrastructures. Yeah, that requires what we call some kind of computing intelligence at different level within the network itself. So what I've seen shown here is just a very visual picture of, say, some network equipment. But in the old days, we call it like CPE equipment. We call it computer premise equipment. We call it sometimes we use it for communication purpose. We call it PABX, private branch exchange, as they call it. And those evolutions have evolved today to become routers and switches and gigabyte switches and all this. So this phenomena of the rise of the network become one of the key driver of mobile computing. Now, as we move along, there for my narrative here, I want to share with you other trends and evolutions. Yeah. The other one is very important to also networks is computer chips itself, microprocessors. There are many companies in the Silicon Valley that have really sparked off. This is why they call it Silicon Valley, right? It's because during the evolution, transistors being used for computing, but then digital computing take place, and circuit boards, circuitries, and with microprocessor are being able to come up with smaller chipsets, faster processors. We've seen through some of these bigger companies that spark off the personal computer industry. They often talks about the second generation from 4-bit, 8-bit, 16-bit, now 64-bit, or maybe even 128 bits. Today, the cycle, this change, this evolution have actually sparked off some theory, and this is what they call Moore's law, actually. The Moore's law talks about how chipsets will be able to scale in a very exponential form over time, and this trend has proven to be valid across all the last few decades in computing, electronics, and overall in telecommunications as well. So the rise of microprocessor is one big important element. Now the next trend is what we've come to understand is what we call user interface. People now get used to instructions or um, making instructions or communicating what the user experience by way of using specific icons. Now this has significant impact because at the end of the day, mobile computing has enhanced the quality of life, has improved the overall communication, the speed, the quality, the real time. All these provide certain enhancement. But the rise of the use of icons have seen since very early stage when Apple has actually developed the first computer, or there was also Commodore and other computers. I'll talk about it later. But the use of icons and perhaps what we call human control interface, we call HCI in academic terms, but human control interface become a very relevant of mobile computing. Without the rise of icons, without the huge adoption of icons, you don't see a lot of the apps of today, or perhaps in our computer, or even in some industrial use of computers, like or air traffic controller. They would use a lot of these types of icons to indicate flight status, perhaps a control mechanism. All these are very important. Then, of course, the next part we'll come into is the proliferation of using touch screens. Now, this is also important to mobile computing because we're talking about in the old stage, we actually use something else. But today, what you and I got used to is perhaps touch screen, something that you can use your finger. There are many ways to improve the experience. There are drag and drop, maybe some we call haptic feedback, or maybe there could be some sound, etc. Now, this has changed the way that us as human interact with computers. Okay. And then, of course, when we talk about computing, the last decade we have actually evolved into having supercomputers. But these supercomputers may not be residing in our bedroom or in our office. It's actually somewhere else. There will be companies that are willing to build these infrastructures and offer them as a fraction of a cost. I think you might argue, okay, well, I still need really good computing power in my bedroom, in my office. Yes, people still use these, right? Today, in front of me, I have a very high power computing, computer here, in the form of a laptop computer, as they call it. But at the end, supporting some of these computing, companies, personal users like myself could actually make use of these supercomputers being built by organizations and offer them as a service. Now, this topic of cloud computing is going to take another topic, but this is one of the trends of mobile computing that I will highlight. Now, we talked about using icons, right? And everybody, everybody would have had this experience of using a keyboard. Today, gamers, hardcore gamers still highly rely on these so-called human-computer interaction device, meaning a keyboard maybe with a mouse. And today, there are still also the use of controllers. We call it remote controllers. That's what we call human-computer interaction. This evolution of empowering certain device to be able to offer instructions become part of the mobile computing ecosystem. Now, moving ahead, we are all already talking about very intelligent buildings, very intelligent devices that may be able to kind of understand what we are thinking. You could be able to communicate with natural language, whether it's in English or in another ethnic language. You basically can command using your voice, and then basically there will be computers interacting. Now, this is also part of a mobile computing ecosystem, and we call it generally human-computer interaction, HCI. So, going back to keyboards, the notion of mobile computing really comes when people think that, first of all, now that I would like to create some instructions or to build some projects, whether this project is for office productivity, whether it's for critical communication, or it could be for a traffic light controller per se. You need some kind of form of computing power, and this is why there were companies back in the, I would say around in the 80s, late 80s, they come up with the idea of computers that are actually, bundled with a keyboard. So we call it a keyboard computer, and a few name brands that are some of them may be still existing, but most of them have been defunct, superseded by different other computer company. But some of these popular ones are like Commodore, Atari, and Bonwell. These are the computers that always rely on a keyboard, a computing device with microprocessors, some memory, and very often they would require the keyboard, which is providing the HCI, the computer interaction. And then as our technology progresses, people still are using just a lot of the rotary phone and slowly moving to digital phone. There is a proliferation, during the 1990s, in that era, that personal device that are being made so that you can actually become your personal assistant. You can memorize a lot of the information. At the same time, it allows you to perhaps do some basic communication. Now, that was the era before all these broadband megabits, internet connectivity is available. I still remember I used a modem to be able to connect to the servers that I used to do a lot of programming. So modems is a very commonplace. Now, a lot of these so-called digital assistants often require a separate modem to actually connect to the outside world. So that was the era of the PDA, which gives mobile computing to a lot of office workers, executives, at that era. And then, of course, there are the powerful laptops of today. The notion of laptop computing has been around for about 20 years now, and I think it has evolved to a very, very mature stage. Very thin, very powerful. It can last for almost 1 or 2 days in terms of battery. It has the memory to cope with all your activities. And behind the scene, what's supporting it is this architecture that it still holds true today, is what we call the client-host server computing, sometimes also called distributed computing. And over here, I just have a very generic network architecture to show you or to depict to you that how it works. It always has some different hosts. There's a back end, and you can have point to point. And this kind of forms the initial architecture of today's internet. And I would like to kind of finish off with this lecture here with what I have always been using as a theory of ping pong. In terms of mobile computing, there's always this need to do make requests and have the server to give you a response. This server, we call it request response architecture, has always been here since day one. Whether you're doing communications, very simple acknowledgement, or you're doing until today, all this server architecture, internet serving all these pages, right? It's all about request response. To one of the laymen to really explain it in terms of mobile computing is basically you're hitting a ping pong, your table tennis, we would call it. You give them a ping, you expect something to come back, and if something doesn't come back, as in a tennis ball, that means that something is wrong. So this ping pong theory, if you can keep it going, according to the communication or the program or the purpose of your request, it should serve well to explain all the distributed computing, cloud computing, mobile computing per se. It doesn't matter what devices. Now, I think this would be the kind of overall explanation of the evolution of mobile computing. Thank you.